The silence was brutal. Smoke coiled above the battlefield, curling through the fractured morning light. Flies swarmed thick over the bodies. From a distance, it looked like death had finished its work. But hidden beneath blood-caked uniforms, a few British soldiers still breathed. Barely. Thomas Whitaker lay with his face pressed into the mud, heartbeat steady, muscles locked. His rifle rested beneath a corpse. Around him, 6 men did the same, playing dead. 5 hours earlier, they'd been ambushed. The order came, fall and don't move. Now, they lay in a no-man's land between life and discovery. A Turkish patrol marched nearby, boots crunching gravel, laughing as they poked lifeless bodies with bayonet. One soldier twitched, stabbed instantly. Thomas didn't blink. He whispered in his head, "Not yet, just wait." The stench of death, the heat, the weight of fallen friends, it pressed against every nerve. But none of them moved. Not even when the vultures came. Hours passed like centuries. The flies were merciless, the sun relentless. Thomas counted every second by heartbeats. 1, 1, 2, 2, 3. He couldn't move. Couldn't itch. Couldn't shift the dead weight on top of him. The body had belonged to Corporal Lane, his friend since training camp. Now Lane's blood had soaked through Thomas's uniform, seeping cold into his ribs. "Hold on," he'd said before dying. Thomas tried to answer, but the shelling had already stolen Lane's breath. Now all that remained was stillness, and the memory of Lane's last words echoing inside Thomas's skull. Nearby, Private Mullins whispered a prayer in his head, mouthing words without breath. One soldier had wet himself hours ago. No one judged. Survival had stripped them of shame. They were no longer soldiers. Not even men. Just shadows buried in meat and mud, waiting for a signal that might never come. It was Mullins who nearly broke. His lip trembled. A tear slipped past his cracked cheek. He was just 19. Thomas had watched him dig trenches with blistered hands, always humming folk songs. But now, Mullins was unraveling. His eyes stared at nothing. He mouthed his mother's name. His fingers twitched. Thomas dared a whisper, not aloud, but through a stare. "Don't." Mullins met it. Understood. Froze. 2 feet away, a Turkish soldier lingered. His boots stopped inches from Mullins' outstretched hand. The soldier paused, scanned the bodies, then spat. The spittle landed on Mullins' sleeve. Still Mullins didn't move. The patrol moved on. When the danger passed, Thomas let his eyes close for a heartbeat. Relief. But not safety. Not yet. The sky turned a dull brass as noon rose. Heat shimmered off steel helmets and bloated corpses. The air reeked of rot, gunpowder, and iron. Flies feasted freely. One buzzed near Thomas's ear, dipped into his mouth. He choked on reflex, only barely stifling it. He squeezed his tongue against his teeth. Blood filled his mouth. Anything to distract. Anything to stay still. Memories returned. His wife in Yorkshire, waving goodbye in the fog. He remembered her red scarf and her hand on her belly. She was 5 months pregnant. If he died here, she'd never know what he gave up. Thomas forced his eyes shut again. Another patrol passed. They didn't stop. Perhaps they believed all life had left this ground. That's what Thomas wanted them to think. Even as death crawled under his skin. A distant boom broke the afternoon silence. A shell in the hills. Dust rose. Thomas didn't flinch. Neither did the others. They had become statues. Shadows. But inside, nerves frayed. Time had lost meaning. Daylight remained their enemy. At night maybe, they'd crawl. Maybe. But that was still hours away. A Turkish scout returned, walking directly toward them. Thomas's eyes tracked without moving. The man bent over, inspecting a corpse. His fingers touched Lane's collar. then Thomas's boot. A single breath could kill him. But the scout didn't notice. He stood, cursed in Turkish, and walked away. Thomas swallowed the scream trapped in his throat. His pulse roared in his ears like artillery fire. The sun began to dip. Shadows stretched. Maybe, just maybe, they would see nightfall. Before this nightmare began, Thomas Whitaker had been a schoolteacher. He used to teach arithmetic to boys barely older than Mullins. He hadn't wanted to enlist, but when his brother died at the Somme, something broke. The next day, he volunteered. Now his brother's watch pressed against his chest, ticking faintly beneath his tunic. Each second was a ghost. He remembered his wife's last letter. "Promise me you'll return. He'll need you." He being the son Thomas hadn't met yet. Guilt clawed deeper than fear. Every breath he held now wasn't just for him, it was for them. Around him, the others held on, each man fighting his own demons in silence. Death whispered to all of them, but no one surrendered. Not yet. Not while there was still memory left to carry. Private Samuel Briggs had once been the joker of the unit. In every trench, every march, he made the men laugh, even when bombs fell like rain. But now, his eyes stared blankly at the sky, lips parted, unmoving. His laughter had died with the others. Still alive, still acting, but dead in spirit. Thomas remembered a night around the campfire when Briggs whispered, "If I die, don't bury me in silence. Laugh for me." Thomas didn't know if that promise could survive here. Laughter would be a betrayal now. Still, he glanced sideways at Briggs, and for the briefest moment, imagined his old grin beneath the grime. Then the illusion faded. Nothing could grow here but ghosts and flies. Somewhere in the haze of heat and death, a quiet voice whispered in Thomas's mind, "Why are you still here?" He had no answer. Not even survival made sense anymore. Each hour pressed down like a punishment. His lips were cracked. His tongue was a stone. The thirst hurt worse than fear. But fear still lived, in the soft rustle of wind that sounded like boots, in the sudden crack of a distant shot. Every noise brought death closer. He longed to scream. Instead, he bit down on a shard of leather torn from his glove. The taste of oil and blood grounded him. He wasn't ready to die, not like this. If this was his end, it had to mean something. Not just rot in silence. Night approached again. A thin breeze carried the scent of burned oil and distant fire. The world dimmed into gray. Shadows returned, and with them, a sliver of hope. In the dying light, Thomas felt the presence of someone beside him. Sergeant Hargreaves, the oldest of them all. Battle-hardened. Stoic. P. His hand rested near Thomas's, fingers curled but trembling. Their eyes met briefly. That was enough. No words. Just recognition. Just shared resolve. For a second, Thomas felt less alone. They were still soldiers, even if the world had left them behind. He blinked twice. Hargreaves blinked back. Silent code. We're not finished yet. When darkness finally swallowed the field, Thomas felt the temperature drop. The heat gave way to cold, and with it came new dangers. But the night was also their only chance. Movement would come soon, not yet but soon. Somewhere, an owl hooted. Somewhere else, boots crushed stones. Thomas inhaled through his teeth. Beneath the silence, the plan still lived. Days ago, before the ambush, Sergeant Hargreaves had spoken clearly. If the assault fails, play dead. At nightfall, regroup and crawl toward the ravine. We take the fortress from within. Now, the ravine was only 50 yards away, 50 yards of death and risk. But as the stars appeared, Thomas's fingers twitched. It was time to remember who they were. Not corpses. Not ghosts. Soldiers. Gunpipe. The first crawl began under a veil of absolute stillness. No orders. No signal. Just instinct. Thomas moved an inch, then froze. Nothing. He moved again, sliding his arm beneath Lane's body and easing it aside. The weight lifted, felt like betrayal. But the mission demanded more than grief. Nearby, Mullins began to stir too. Mud clung to his cheek as he inched toward Thomas. Behind them, Briggs shifted silently, dragging a leg that no longer bent. They didn't speak. Couldn't. Even the smallest sound would draw death. The ravine loomed in the dark like a promise wrapped in nightmare. Between them and that freedom lay a gauntlet of corpses, discarded shells, and watching eyes. Each foot forward was a prayer and a risk. But they moved, inch by inch, resurrecting themselves from the dead. They had gone less than 20 feet when a sound cracked the silence. A gasp. Way, a gasp. Briggs. His leg gave way, caught beneath a shattered rifle. He collapsed with a dull thud. Every soldier froze. Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs. Then from the ridge above came a flicker of light, a sentry's lantern. It scanned lazily, sweeping across the dead. Thomas pressed his face flat into the ground, willing himself to vanish. The light paused near Briggs. Time dissolved. The beam lingered, then moved on. No alarm. No shots. They got lucky. But Briggs had to be left behind. Hargreaves reached over, touched Briggs' shoulder once, then pointed forward. Briggs nodded. No words. His role was now to stay and draw no notice. Alone, forgotten, heroic. By the time they reached the halfway point, Thomas's knees were raw and bleeding. The world had narrowed to breath and dirt. The ravine seemed no closer. Mullins wheezed softly, face gray. I can't, he mouthed. Thomas grabbed his sleeve, held firm. You will. No sound passed between them, only raw resolve in their eyes. Together, they pushed on. Behind them, Sergeant Hargreaves watched the rear, scanning for movement. Each man had taken on a piece of command. Unity was their lifeline now. Above, a flare suddenly burst, white fire slicing the sky. The world was bathed in blinding light. Thomas and Mullins dropped flat, faces buried in rot. If anyone moved, it would be over. But the flare faded. No shots came. The gods were still undecided. The crawl resumed, slower now, pain etched into every motion. Mullins began to mutter under his breath, eyes wide and unfocused. Delirium. Thomas gritted his teeth and wrapped an arm around him, dragging him inch by inch. They could not afford another loss. Not now. In the distance, they spotted the ruins of an old outpost wall, crumbled stone overgrown with weeds. It marked the mouth of the ravine. Safety. Just 30 yards. The men gathered beneath a ledge, breathless. Hargreaves held up 2 fingers. 2 at a time, he whispered. The first pair moved like shadows. Thomas waited his turn, heart pounding. This was it. The threshold between death and vengeance. One mistake now, and it was all for nothing. Thomas and Mullins made their dash. Low to the ground, fast but silent. The ravine swallowed them in darkness. Once inside, the world changed. No gunfire. No bodies. Just dripping stone and distant echoes. It felt like crossing into another life. The narrow passage led into the fortress, an old drainage tunnel from centuries ago, forgotten by most but marked on Hargreaves' hand-drawn map. Thomas helped Mullins lean against the wall. Their group was almost complete. One more pair would join. Then they'd strike. But not yet. They waited in silence, the tunnel breathing around them like a sleeping beast. Thomas clenched his rifle now, not for defense, but for justice. For Lane. For Briggs. For every breath he had buried for 5 days. The tunnel narrowed into darkness, the ceiling low, air thick with damp. Every drip echoed like a gunshot. The group advanced in silence, feet brushing ancient stone. Thomas led the way now, rifle raised, nerves flaring with every step. A whisper of light appeared ahead, A faint torch flickered behind iron grates. As they approached, voices echoed, Ottoman Turkish. But one voice was different. Sharper. English. A man speaking both tongues fluently, giving orders with authority. Thomas stopped cold. He knew that voice. Lieutenant Charles Avery died. Once British. Now, betrayer. A court-martialed deserter presumed dead in Mesopotamia. But here he was, alive and commanding Ottoman troops. Hargreaves's eyes locked with Thomas's. Recognition. Betrayal wasn't a rumor. It was real. And it was standing between them and the fortress. Thomas's breath caught. The last time he'd heard Avery's voice was at a camp in Baghdad, calm, composed, reading poetry before supper. That man had vanished during a nighttime patrol. Desertion, they'd said. But now Thomas understood. Avery hadn't run, he'd switched sides. Traded country for survival. Maybe for power. And now he wore Ottoman colors, directing men who had slaughtered Lane, who had stabbed their wounded for sport. Rage flooded Thomas's veins, but Hargreaves grabbed his arm, grounding him. Not yet, he mouthed. Revenge would wait for the plan. But Thomas's fingers tightened on the rifle trigger. Avery had become the enemy. And no matter what followed, he would not walk away again. From the tunnel's shadow, Thomas watched Avery speak with Turkish officers, gesturing toward the fortress gates. He was planning reinforcements. Timing. Movement. Tight. The final layer of betrayal settled in. Avery wasn't a hostage, wasn't coerced. He was invested. Strategic. Comfortable. Hargreaves leaned in close. I'll seal this place in 20 minutes. That's our window. A new surge of urgency cut through the pain. Mullins, barely conscious, nodded from the wall. They would act now, or die here. Hargreaves handed out the final assignments. 2 men would flank left, Thomas and Mullins would cover the breach, the rest would sweep the courtyard. Leave Avery to me, Thomas said, voice like broken glass. No one argued. They emerged like phantoms. Thomas surged forward with Mullins beside him, rifle raised. Gunfire erupted, sharp and surgical. The Ottoman guards reeled in confusion. Silent for days, the British ghosts now roared like hell itself. Chaos exploded in the courtyard. Hargreaves took down 2 men with perfect precision. The old soldier moved like vengeance given flesh. Thomas saw Avery backing toward the command room, pistol drawn, face pale. You should have died at the river, Thomas shouted. Avery's eyes locked with his. No denial. Only arrogance. You still think this war has sides, he replied. Then he fired. The shot grazed Thomas's shoulder, pain blooming, but he didn't fall. He advanced. Avery retreated. The chase had begun. Thomas cornered Avery in the map room. Stone walls, scattered charts, oil lamp flickering. It didn't have to be this way, Avery said, lowering his pistol. I offered them something better than death. You offered them betrayal, Thomas hissed. We buried our dead for 5 days. We earned this. Avery smirked. You're no different than I am. You just lost slower. Thomas raised his rifle. But he hesitated, only for a moment. Avery reached for his belt. Thomas fired. The shot echoed like a hammer strike. Avery collapsed, eyes wide. Silence returned. Thomas stood over him, chest heaving. Not triumph. Not peace. Just the end of a story that never should have started. Gunfire echoed through the fortress like thunder in stone halls. The courtyard was a battlefield once more. But this time, the dead rose. Thomas charged forward, rallying the few who remained. Hargreaves, wounded but unstoppable, fired methodically from the flank. Mullins dragged himself across the gravel, firing from the hip, eyes glassy but focused. Every step they took was over blood, over memories, over comrades they'd buried in silence. No more hiding. No more playing dead. Now they fought like men who had nothing left to lose. An Ottoman captain shouted orders from the watchtower. Hargreaves aimed, fired. His last bullet. The man fell like a toppled statue. The fortress groaned under the weight of rebellion. It was happening. They were taking it back. The inner sanctum held its own horrors. Bloodied medical stretchers, maps smeared with ash, and prisoners. British, French, even Arab fighters, locked in cells too weak to cheer. Thomas and Mullins broke the locks, dragging the survivors out. Some crawled. Others cried. One hugged Thomas without words. The rescue was more than strategic. It was human. "There's a back gate," a prisoner rasped. "Guarded, but weak." Thomas nodded, called to the others. This wasn't just a takeover anymore. It was an escape. A liberation. They pushed toward the gate, every hallway a labyrinth of noise and death. Hargreaves limped but kept up. "Leave me, I'll cover rear," he said. Thomas shook his head. "We'll leave together, or not at all." The back gate loomed ahead, steel, rusted and guarded by 2 riflemen. Thomas signaled. Mullins flanked right. A prisoner with shaking hands flanked left. Hargreaves took the center. On cue, they attacked. Gunfire roared. One Ottoman guard fell instantly. The second ducked and fired back. Mullins cried out, a shot to the shoulder. Thomas surged forward, tackled the guard into the gate itself. They struggled, blades drawn. Blood spilled. Thomas rammed his knife home. The guard went limp. Silence. The gate was theirs. But the price was visible. Mullins lay against the wall, eyes fluttering. "Did we do it?" he gasped. Thomas knelt beside him. "Not yet, but almost." He pressed Mullins' hand. "Stay with me." They blew the gate open with captured munitions. The explosion tore through the stone, lighting the night sky. The survivors, ragged, limping but alive, pushed through into the hills beyond. Behind them, the fortress began to crumble. Its command broken. Its soul gutted. Hargreaves covered their retreat, firing his last rounds into the smoke. When the final click of an empty chamber echoed, he turned and followed. Thomas carried Mullins. Every step burned. But he didn't stop. Not until they reached the ridgeline, where Allied signals blinked like stars across the dark. "We made it," Thomas said. Hargreaves dropped to a knee, exhausted. "Damn right we did," he muttered. But none of them smiled. Too many hadn't made it through the gate. Dawn broke over a broken world. The fortress smoldered behind them, reduced to silence. In the pale light, Thomas sat beside Mullins, who lay wrapped in a torn blanket. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Hargreaves stood watch, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of counterattack. None came. They were safe. For now. Thomas pulled the cracked pocket watch from his chest. It had stopped ticking. He set it on a rock and let it be. Time for them had already run out 5 days ago. Everything since was borrowed. He looked at the surviving men, ghosts with beating hearts. "We lived," he whispered. But the words tasted hollow. What they lived through would never leave them, and what they lost would never be counted. The official report called it a strategic victory by a small British unit behind enemy lines. Medals were issued. Names were mentioned. But no one asked how they did it. No one wanted the truth, that they survived by becoming the dead. At the field hospital, Thomas lay on a cot beside Mullins. Doctors patched wounds but couldn't mend silence. Thomas didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, it was to whisper Lane's name. Hargreaves, wrapped in bandages, sat alone, sharpening a blade that no longer needed use. "War's over here," a nurse said softly. But for the men who returned, it never truly ended. Their ghosts still followed, shadows on every wall, in every corner of light. Mullins recovered slowly. His shoulder wound would leave a permanent tremor in his hand, but he lived. One morning he asked Thomas, "Did we win?" Thomas didn't answer. Not at first. Then he said, "We didn't die. That's something." But Mullins didn't smile. They both knew survival wasn't victory. It was just breath. Later that day, they were called to meet a colonel. Formal words were spoken, commendations, service records, citations. Thomas stared through the man as he read. None of it mattered. They hadn't fought for medals. They fought because they were left with no other choice. When the colonel said, "You men are heroes," Hargreaves muttered, "No, sir, just survivors." The room fell silent. A week later, Thomas stood outside the barracks, uniform pressed, gear in hand. His orders said, "Rotation home." But home felt like a word for another man. He watched soldiers laugh nearby, new recruits, fresh uniforms, clean boots. He envied their ignorance. Hargreaves passed by, nodding once. "You heading out?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Back to Yorkshire? Got someone waiting?" Thomas looked down. "A son. Haven't met him yet." Hargreaves patted his shoulder, firm. "He'll need you. Not the soldier, the father." That night, Thomas boarded the train alone. The station lights faded behind him. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. Just a little. The countryside rolled past in blurred color. Green fields, gray stone fences, distant sheep. Thomas stared out the train window, fingers tracing patterns in the fogged glass. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every jolt of the train reminded him of shell impacts. Every whistle, a distant scream. He saw Lane's face in the hills, Briggs' laughter in the wind. Ghosts didn't haunt buildings. They followed hearts. In his pocket, the cracked watch still sat, its hands frozen at the hour they began the crawl. He didn't wind it. Time had become a lie. The only truth was in the silence he carried. And the boy waiting at the end of the line. Thomas stepped onto the platform at Harrogate Station. No band, no crowd. Just a woman in a red scarf. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw him. He didn't run. He walked. Each step slow, deliberate. When he reached her, she touched his face gently, as if confirming he was real. Then she stepped aside, revealing a small boy clutching her skirt. Thomas knelt. The boy stared, then held out a hand. "What? Are you the soldier?" he asked. Thomas smiled softly. "Not anymore." He took the boy's hand, rising. The war hadn't ended. Not really. But in that moment, something inside him shifted. From silence to life. From memory to future. From ghost to father. Years passed. Wars changed names. Maps shifted. But for Thomas Whitaker, the battlefield never truly disappeared. On quiet mornings, he still heard the flies, still felt the weight of Lane's body across his back. But life moved on. His son, Jacob, grew tall and kind. Thomas never told him the full story. Only fragments. A name. A friend. A watch. But one autumn morning, as leaves fell like memories, Thomas packed a small bag and left home alone. He told no one where he was going. Only that he had to pay respects. He carried with him a weathered box containing a rusted dog tag, a folded Union Jack, and a cracked pocket watch stuck at 4:12. The hour their resurrection had begun. The fortress was still there, abandoned, crumbling, silent. Time had softened its cruelty, but not erased it. Moss grew over stone. Bullet holes marked the walls like scars. Thomas stood at the ruined gate, staring into the place where he had died and come back. He stepped through slowly, boots crunching over gravel and leaves. Each wall whispered. He followed the corridor to the map room. The table was gone. The lamp shattered. But the bloodstain still lingered on the floor, faded, but present. He knelt and laid down the box. Then he sat beside it. No tears. Just silence. This was a grave no one visited. So he came, not to grieve, but to witness. He lit a single candle, just like Hargreaves had done on the 5th night. The flame flickered, small, but defiant. He spoke aloud for the first time in years. Lane, Briggs, Hargreaves, we made it. Some of us. The names filled the empty room like echoes returning home. I played dead for 5 days, he whispered. But you stayed behind. He pulled the watch from the box, ran a thumb across its fractured face. Then set it beside the candle. You gave me time. As the wind moved through the cracks in the fortress walls, the flame danced, almost like it bowed. He sat there, as shadows stretched. A man remembering the ones who were never remembered. As dusk settled, Thomas stood and folded the Union Jack carefully, placing it atop the box. He tucked the dog tag inside, then sealed it shut. No plaque. No ceremony. Just memory. He walked back through the ruins slower now. At the main gate he turned once more to look. The fortress didn't look like a battlefield anymore. Just stone and silence. But he knew the truth. Beneath those stones were echoes of gunfire, whispered names, and the breathless courage of men who refused to surrender. Men who played dead so others could live. He placed the box beneath a broken pillar, covered it with stones. Not a grave. A promise. Before leaving, Thomas pulled a slip of paper from his coat pocket. On it, one sentence: history only remembers who won, never who waited to die. He pressed it into a crack in the wall beside the gate. Then he walked away, boots crunching into the fading light. He never returned. The fortress stood silent, still, holding the secret of what they'd done, of who they'd been. A breeze moved the leaves. The candle flickered one last time, and the watch, tucked in its box, remained frozen, its silence louder than gunfire, its stillness deeper than the grave. The dead stayed. The living moved on, whined sow, and history whispered nothing.